For years, Marcel Lebrun sat at the helm of one of Canada's fastest-growing tech companies. Radian 6, his brainchild, wasn't just another startup. It was a juggernaut in social media analytics, catching the eye of Silicon Valley's biggest players. Inside sleek offices and boardrooms flooded with charts, forecasts, and investor calls, Marcel was the man everyone wanted to be. Calm under pressure, visionary, and very, very rich. By 2011, whispers in the tech world turned into headlines. Salesforce had just sealed a deal to buy Radian 6 for nearly $350 million. It was the kind of number that would send most CEOs packing their bags for exotic islands, planning long vacations, or buying mountain estates far from the noise. His name was now etched into Canada's entrepreneurial Hall of Fame. He could do whatever he wanted. He had won. So when he announced he was stepping away from business altogether, people assumed he was retiring in style, buying yachts, building mansions, starting another high-profile venture. Marcel had the means to do anything. And yet, he didn't do any of that. Instead, something curious began happening. Friends noticed he wasn't flying off to Paris or sipping cocktails on the coast. There were no press releases, no ribbon cuttings for a new company. In fact, Marcel disappeared from the spotlight. Then the rumors started. "He's building something," one colleague said. "But not tech," whispered another. No one could figure it out. Until, one cloudy morning in Fredericton, New Brunswick, a few passing drivers noticed the millionaire who used to wear suits was now in jeans and gloves, standing beside a construction site, helping move lumber. And beside him, a group of people few expected him to be with, those who had spent years with nothing. No one knew it yet, but Marcel Lebrun was about to change the definition of success, not just for himself, but for an entire city. Tucked on the edge of Fredericton, there was a patch of land most people ignored. Overgrown grass, uneven dirt, the kind of place developers glanced at once, and never again. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't promising, and it certainly wasn't profitable. But Marcel Lebrun saw something else. He stood there quietly one morning, boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground, arms crossed, eyes scanning the space like an architect sees blueprints in a blank page. To others, it was just forgotten land. To Marcel, it was the start of something powerful. This wasn't going to be a charity handout. It wasn't a tax write-off or a photo op. He had something bigger in mind. A village, real homes, with real keys. A place where dignity was restored, where people could sit at a kitchen table, lock a front door, and feel, finally, safe. He would call it 12 Neighbors. Because to him, that's what the world had forgotten. People experiencing homelessness weren't statistics. They were neighbors. And a city wasn't whole until all its people had a place to belong. The first thing he did? He dug in his own pockets. $4 million. Just like that. No fanfare, no announcements, just action. Then came the calls to the city, the long meetings with skeptical officials, the paperwork that never seemed to end. At every turn, people asked the same thing. Why you? Why would a millionaire who once negotiated multi-million-dollar deals now be standing in line at the local permit office, sketching housing layouts, and trying to figure out how to stretch every dollar to build more homes? But Marcel had already answered that question in his heart. He wasn't chasing profit anymore. He was chasing peace. And it wasn't in gated communities or investment portfolios. It was here, on a piece of ignored land, beside people the world had stopped seeing. As the first tiny home went up, paint still wet, windows shining, a few curious people wandered by, some of them from the nearby shelter, some from tents along the river. They watched as the man in charge of it all didn't bark orders or supervise from a distance. He built beside them, hammer in hand, sweat on his brow. And little by little, trust started to form, nail by nail, wall by wall. The morning air was crisp as the third tiny home neared completion. Marcel wiped sawdust from his forehead and stepped back to admire the fresh coat of white paint glistening in the sun. But today, the work site was different. It wasn't just about hammers or housing, it was about people. The walls were up, but now it was time to build something more powerful. Trust. Melissa Armstrong stood quietly at the edge of the lot. She didn't speak much. For months, she had lived in a tent near the riverbank. Harsh winters, lonely nights. More than once she'd been passed over or ignored. She'd heard of projects like this before. Promises made by people who didn't stay long enough to remember your name. But Marcel stayed. He asked her one morning, just like that, if she wanted to help paint a home. At first, Melissa laughed. "I've never painted anything except my nails," she joked. Marcel handed her a brush anyway. The hours passed slowly, filled with small talk and the kind of quiet only two strangers can share when they're not strangers anymore. They talked about her love for cooking, her dream of one day running her own kitchen. Marcel didn't just listen, he remembered. Within weeks, a new building started going up beside the tiny homes, the community cafe and center. Not just a coffee shop, but a place where residents like Melissa could work, learn, and feel, finally, part of something. Real jobs, real purpose. "I see myself as a community builder," Marcel told a local reporter who dropped by. "We're not just putting up houses, we're creating a space where people heal." As word spread, more came forward. A man who'd once taught carpentry offered to build shelves. A woman who loved gardening asked for a patch of soil. And Marcel? He wasn't watching from a window. He was in the middle of it all. Cooking, painting, laughing. Some nights, he'd stay long after everyone left, sipping coffee with a resident who couldn't sleep, or just sitting quietly beside someone having a rough day. The walls of those tiny homes? They began to carry stories of second chances, shared meals, and conversations that made people feel seen again. And Marcel, the millionaire once surrounded by data and deadlines, found something no money had ever given him. Belonging. The sun was barely up when the aroma of fresh coffee began drifting through the newly finished cafe in the heart of the 12 Neighbors village. No glowing signs, no expensive branding, just a small hand-painted board above the door that read, "The Good Neighbor Cafe." Inside, the hum of hope was louder than any machine. Melissa Armstrong stood behind the counter, apron snug, hair tied up in a bandana, flipping pancakes with the confidence of a pro. Just months ago, she had been fighting to survive another night in a cold tent. Now, she was training to be head chef of a cafe that didn't just serve food, it served dignity. There was no menu on the wall. Instead, customers, many of them residents, were greeted with something unexpected, a warm smile and a simple question. "What do you need today?" Some asked for coffee, some for conversation. Others just wanted a place to sit without feeling judged. And Marcel? He was there too, mopping the floor, taking orders, washing dishes when things got hectic. No fanfare, no title. Just another pair of hands doing the work. He'd always believed business was about solving problems. But here, the problems weren't about revenue margins. They were about loneliness, purpose, forgotten potential. And for once, he wasn't trying to scale anything. He was just being present. Word of the cafe spread across Fredericton. First came the curious visitors. Then came local organizations offering workshops. Artists dropped off paintings. Musicians showed up with guitars. Even former skeptics from city council dropped by for lunch and stayed longer than expected. It wasn't just a cafe, it was a symbol, a space built on the radical belief that everyone has value, and that value isn't measured in degrees or dollars. One afternoon, a journalist from CBC arrived to do a feature. She asked Marcel what made him trade his boardroom view for a cafe stool. He looked at her and simply said, "In business, I closed deals. Here, I open hearts." And then he excused himself to help Melissa serve a man who'd just walked in with nothing in his hands but a story worth hearing. Because here at the Good Neighbor Cafe, you didn't need money to buy breakfast. You just needed to belong. The tiny homes began rising one by one, each like a quiet promise to someone who had once been forgotten. Compact but complete, with a kitchen, bathroom, and space to breathe. They weren't just shelters. They were beginnings. For every key handed over, there was a backstory, gritty, raw, and deeply human. There was Greg, who used to sleep behind a grocery store loading dock. He now spent mornings tending a small garden outside his new home. There was Nina, a former nurse who'd lost everything in a medical crisis. She now helped other residents schedule clinic visits. And of course, there was Melissa, whose laughter now filled the cafe kitchen, cooking with the rhythm of someone who remembered hunger too well to take joy for granted. But behind the bricks, Marcel was building something far more ambitious than housing. He was building structure for the soul. The 12 Neighbors Project wasn't just about walls. It was about worth. Each home came with the promise of more than just shelter. It came with opportunity. Marcel's team began organizing workshops, woodworking, art, resume building. They opened retail spaces where residents could sell handmade crafts. Slowly, residents were becoming not just recipients, but contributors. One day, a local businessman toured the village. After walking through the cafe, watching Marcel serve a table, he turned and asked bluntly, "What's your angle? What's the end game here?" Marcel smiled, a bit of drywall dust still on his shirt. "There's no angle, no flip, no ROI. Just this, seeing people stand taller when they realize they matter." The businessman blinked, unsure what to say, and Marcel added, "I used to build platforms for companies to listen to customers. Now, I'm building spaces for people to listen to each other." It was a simple idea. Give people a place, give them purpose, and then get out of their way. Soon, stories from the village began reaching far beyond Fredericton. News outlets picked it up. Visitors came from across Canada to learn how they could replicate the model. Politicians stopped by, not for handshakes and headlines, but to understand. Because this wasn't just a housing solution. It was a quiet revolution in how we see the homeless. Not as a problem, but as part of the answer. And somewhere between the laughter in the cafe, the art hanging in the new gallery space, and the evening walks through rows of tiny homes, Marcel realized something profound. He had spent years mastering algorithms and metrics, but here, in this little village he helped create, he was finally learning the equation for belonging. One late autumn evening, the sky over Fredericton turned a soft amber as the village lights flickered on, each home like a glowing ember in a long-forgotten fire. Marcel stood near the community center, sipping coffee out of a chipped mug, the kind you find in any old kitchen, not the kind found in million-dollar boardrooms. He was chatting with a man named Derek, a resident who once spiraled into homelessness after a job injury and divorce. For months, Derek barely spoke, even when offered a home. But now, wrapped in a hoodie embroidered with the cafe logo, he laughed freely, telling Marcel about a recipe he wanted to try on next week's menu. Their conversation was interrupted by a woman across the courtyard. She ran up to Marcel and threw her arms around him in a hug so sudden it caught them both off guard. She whispered, "I haven't hugged anyone in years." He didn't know her story. Not yet. But that moment said enough. Later that week, a CBC crew returned to do a follow-up. They had heard about the hug from someone on staff and asked Marcel how it felt. He didn't talk about the money or the real estate, or even the recognition the project had started to receive across Canada. He simply said, "It was the most valuable return I've ever received." That interview went viral, not because of some dramatic quote, but because of the quiet truth behind it. In a world obsessed with success stories built on accumulation, here was one built on letting go. Letting go of titles, letting go of comfort, letting go of the illusion that joy is bought. Marcel began receiving letters, hundreds of them, from people in cities grappling with homelessness, from CEOs who confessed they hadn't felt joy in years, from parents who read the story to their children as a bedtime lesson about kindness. Soon, visitors came not just to see the homes, but to learn the blueprint for human connection. Mayors, nonprofits, teachers. They walked through the village expecting to find buildings and left having found something deeper. A model of empathy that could be replicated, brick by brick. And through it all, Marcel kept showing up. He still took shifts at the cafe, still attended resident meetings, still helped build new homes, because for him, it was never a project, it was a promise. And maybe the world didn't need more millionaires chasing bigger yachts. Maybe it needed more who were willing to sit on broken stools, serve pancakes with strangers, and listen to stories that never made the news. Because in those tiny homes and warm cups of coffee, Marcel Lebrun had found something his tech empire never gave him: peace. The wind whispered through the narrow rows of tiny homes as Marcel walked the gravel paths at dusk. A soft golden glow spilled from the cafe windows, laughter drifting out like music. No stage, no microphones, just the kind of joy that didn't need an audience. The 100th home was complete. There was no grand opening, no ribbon cutting, no headline-grabbing speech, just a quiet moment, standing beside a woman who once slept in a stairwell and now had a bedroom, a kitchen, and her name written on a mailbox. Marcel asked if she liked the curtains. She said they were the first she'd ever chosen for herself. He smiled, hands in his jacket pockets, nodding slowly. That was the moment. He didn't need applause. The projects he once pitched to billionaires were now replaced by conversations in coffee lines. The spreadsheets and IPOs were now blueprints for gardens, art walls, and communal workshops. He'd spent years racing toward success, but here, success moved at walking pace, barefoot, and sometimes late for dinner. A boy zipped past him on a scooter, yelling to his mom about a drawing he made in the community center. A man sat outside his home repairing a bike for another resident. And Marcel? He just kept walking, invisible in the best way. No longer the millionaire, just a neighbor. A few steps later, he paused, watching Melissa Armstrong teach 2 new hires how to prep eggs for tomorrow's breakfast. She looked up, caught his eye, and waved him over. "Try this," she said, holding out a spoon. "We're testing a new syrup." Marcel tasted it and grinned. "You've outdone yourself." Melissa smiled. "I'm just getting started." So was everyone. As the stars blinked awake over Fredericton, Marcel sat on the cafe porch, alone but never lonely. He looked out over what they had built. Homes, yes, but also safety, trust, and hope stitched into the soil. There was nothing left to prove. No cameras, no noise, just peace.